where you have 64 teams. They get to compete and try and win a trophy for March Madness. And so, in previous years, obviously, men's basketball has kind of been in the forefront. There's a lot of spotlight and highlight on the men's tournament. But this year, and honestly last year too probably, we've seen an emergence of interest in women's basketball, mostly due to the phenomenal 2021 draft class, or recruiting class, of women's basketball, which features many star players like Caitlin Clark, Paige Buchers, I believe it's Caitlin Cardoso. She's on South Carolina, and Cameron Brink and Angel Reese. So we've come to a time where women's basketball, in terms of college, is being talked about much more than men's, which is honestly like a remarkable thing. It's a super good thing for the sport. You know, there's a lot of talk about how the WNBA doesn't get enough like glory or attention, and you know, it's very hard to figure out how to up those numbers, and I don't think that's going to be a problem anymore, because with Caitlin Clark, you know, arguably the best female basketball player we've ever seen in terms of college production, she's about to enter the WNBA, so she is declared for the draft. You've got Angel Reese declared for the draft. I don't know about some of the others, if they're declared or not officially as of yet, but very big time for women's basketball. And then, of course, you also have the men's basketball tournament that had some sensational players that are being talked about nationally. Zach Edey of Purdue. You've got Donovan Clingan of the UConn Huskies. You also have, to be honest, I don't know a bunch of guys who are in the men's basketball tournament. One of the few that I did know, Rob Dillingham of Kentucky, and what was his name? Oh, Jack Goelke of Oakland. Yeah, he's more of a, I don't want to say one-hit wonder, but it was a guy that I heard of because of how well he played in the first round. But anyways, enough glazing on my end. Let's go over both of these brackets, see how they panned out, which teams were the most dominant in their respective tournaments, and who won each March Madness bracket. So, first up, we're gonna do ladies first. So, in the round 1 of the women's March Madness bracket, we had Regional 1 in Albany. You've got South Carolina, the number 1 seed, defeating 16th seeded Presbyterian at a score of 91-39. Absolutely dominant. South Carolina, just as an FYI, they were undefeated in the regular season. They did not suffer a single loss. So, very big year for them. Then after that, you've got the 8th seeded North Carolina defeating the 9th seeded Michigan State at a final score of 59-56. Then you have 5th seeded Oklahoma defeating 12th seeded FGCU with a final score of 73-70. Then you have number 4 Indiana defeating number 13 Fairfield with a final score of 89-56. After that, you've got 6th seed Nebraska taking down 11th seed Texas A&M, not without a fight. The final score of this game was 61-59 in favor of Nebraska. Then you've got 3-seeded Oregon State facing off against 14th seeded Eastern Washington. And Oregon State was able to win this game with a final margin of victory of 73-51. After that, you've got 7th seeded Ole Miss was probably the part of the bracket that most people were paying the most attention to, just because it had the Iowa Hawkeyes featuring Caitlin Clark and also LSU, the champions from the previous year. So, first up, we have the number 1 seeded Iowa Hawkeyes defeating 16th seeded Holy Cross with a final score of 91-65. Then you have 8 seed West Virginia beating 9 seeded Princeton at a final score of 63-53. Also, it is worth noting that in the first region, there were no upsets. It was strictly the, what do you call them? The favored, the higher seeded teams that won every single game. So after that, you have the 5th seeded Colorado Buffaloes defeating 12th seeded Drake with a final score of 86-72. Next, you have Kansas State taking on Portland. This is a battle between the 4 seed and the 13th seed, and Kansas State walked away with a victory with a final score of 78-65. Then you have the first upset of the tournament in a very close fought game. The 6 seeded Louisville went down to 11 seeded MTSU in a game that finished with a final score of 71-69. After that, you have the former champions LSU at the 3 seed taking on 14th seeded Rice, and they won that game 70-60. Then you have the 7 seed Creighton taking on the 10th seed University UNLV. I don't know if UNLV is actually University of Las Vegas or not. Yeah, so we're gonna go UNLV. I almost, and I mean it's too late now. I probably did mess it up, but whatever that stands for. Creighton won 87-73. And finally, you have the 2nd seeded UCLA Bruins taking on CA Baptist. Fight between the 2nd and 15th seed, and the Bruins won 84-55. After that, we move into Regional 3, which was in Portland. So first up, you have the number 1 seeded Tennessee got the better of Kansas, winning 73-55. After that, you have 4-seeded Virginia Tech hosting 5-seeded Baylor, and Baylor was able to pull off the upset in that one, winning 75-72 in a close game. Then you have the 3-seeded UConn Huskies facing off against the 6-seeded Syracuse. UConn was able to get the better of Syracuse in that one, winning 72-64. Then you have 7th-seeded Duke pulling off an upset against the 2nd-seeded Ohio State, winning 75-63. And finally, getting back into Region 4, you have number 1-seeded Alabama, number 1-seeded Texas facing off against the 8th-seeded Alabama. Texas got the win, winning 65-54. Then you have the 4-seed Gonzaga facing off against the 5th-seed USA. Oh my goodness. I had to take them off. It was driving me nuts. Okay. You have the 4-seed Gonzaga facing off against the 5th-seeded Utah, and Gonzaga walks away with victory 77-66. Next, you have NC State, the 3-seed, challenging 6th-seeded Tennessee, and NC State wins that game by 7 points. Final score 79-72. And then you've got an overtime game between the number 2-seeded Stanford and the number 7-seeded Iowa State. In this game, Stanford walked away with the victory with a final score of 87-81. So, after that, we move into the Sweet 16, and these games took place between March 29th and March 30th. So, first up, in Region 1, you have the 1st-seeded South Carolina battling against the 4-seeded Indiana. Now, this was a much tougher game for South Carolina. Their first game, they won by 52 points. Their second game, they won by 47 points. They only won by 4 against Indiana, but nonetheless, they still walked away with a victory. Then you have the number 2-seed Notre Dame facing off against the number 3-seed Oregon State. We finally see our very first upset on this side of the bracket. It is a victory by Oregon State over Notre Dame with a final score of 70-65. Then you have number 1-seed Iowa taking on number 5-seed Colorado. Iowa would win this game by a healthy margin, finishing 89-68. After that, you have number 3-seed LSU facing off against number 2-seed UCLA, and the former champions got the better of the higher seed in this one. So we have an upset. LSU wins this game 78-69. Then moving into Region 3, we had USC taking on Baylor University. USC was the 1-seed, Baylor was the 5, and USC got the better of Baylor in this game, winning 74-70. After that, you have the number 3-seeded UConn Huskies facing off against the 7th-seeded Duke, and UConn won this game 53-45. After that, we move into our 4th and final region. You have number 1-seeded Texas taking on 4-seeded Gonzaga, and Texas wins that game 69-47. And you have number 3-seeded NC State facing off against number 2-seeded Stanford, with Stanford losing this game. So another upset. NC State wins 77-67. following their loss in the championship game last year. Then after that, you have, I guess it was number 1 versus number 3 in all of the 4 regions. In Region 3, you have number 1 seeded USC facing off against the number 3 seed UConn Huskies, and the Huskies actually were able to get the upset in this one, winning 80-73. And finally, you've got NC State facing off against Texas, with NC State as the 3 seed and Texas as the 1 seed. NC State got the better of their opponent, winning 76-66. So after that, we move into the Final Four, 2 very elite matchups between the best of each region. First up, you have South Carolina facing off against NC State. This is the winner of Region 1 against the winner of Region 4. South Carolina won in this matchup, winning 78-59. And finally, on the other side of the bracket, you have the Iowa Hawkeyes facing off against UConn. This was a controversial ending. It was a very close game, and Iowa ended up winning it 71-69, but people were pretty mad because the game was basically decided on a foul call rather than any action on the court. There was like 15 seconds left in the game. The Huskies had the ball. They were dribbling it, and the referees called a moving screen on the Huskies. And so it was an offensive foul. The ball was turned over, and it went to Iowa. And people were really upset because some people said it was a soft foul. Some people said it wasn't a foul. And a lot of people were just mad that you had such a great game decided by the refs rather than the players. Having looked at the play and seeing the screen that they called, yeah, it was a moving screen, but I don't think it was too major. I think it's one of those things where, like, I didn't see the whole game, so I don't know with what consistency they were calling the screens, but for a major moment like that, it is a little bit disappointing that the game had to come down to a call to be decided rather than, just let UConn get a shot up if it was like a shooting foul or something. I don't know. It could be different, but really just negated the position. UConn couldn't do anything after that, and it's kind of a shame. Could have seen a potential game winner, or maybe they tie the game and the Iowa Hawkeyes have to hit a game winner, or it goes to overtime. Generally, I am in favor of letting the players decide the game. Now, obviously, there are a couple times where there's a blatantly obvious missed call, and then you have people being really mad about it as well. Like, I'm trying to think. This is the wrong sport, but the Saints and the Rams in the, I think it was the NFC Championship game. A few years ago, you had the Rams defender come way too early on a tackle when some Saints player was running a route. Clear pass interference, like 12 times out of 12, that's pass interference, but for some reason the refs didn't call it. It was pretty huge. I think it would have set them up too. It would have set up the Saints in really good position. They probably could have won the game. The only difference was it didn't decide the game. I think that game still went to overtime and the Saints choked. So it's less bad. Yes, you can say that they should have won it. It shouldn't have gotten to that point, but they still had a chance. Whereas in this game, UConn did not have a chance after this call. So it really took the game away from them, out of the players' hands. So I feel for this a little bit more. But, UConn played an amazing game, and it is what it is. And so, finally, you have the last game, the championship game of against South Carolina, who is eyeing the first ever perfect season in women's college basketball history, I believe. And then the Iowa Hawkeyes, who are led by Caitlin Clark, who has basically shattered any scoring record by both men and women in terms of college basketball. So, great team, great player. Who's going to come out on top? I think that this game was I saw something about it. I saw a post saying that, the championship game for women's basketball this year was, the most watched broadcast, the most watched non-football broadcast that has been aired by whatever network, in, the last few years. I don't know, I'm doing a horrible job of recounting what it is, but basically, it got more views than, any baseball game, any basketball game, or any men's basketball March Madness game, any sports broadcast outside of football. It was the biggest sporting event, so that's a huge deal. Very big for the sport, very big for women's basketball, and on the biggest of stages, you've got South Carolina taking down Iowa, winning the NCAA March Madness tournament. This is, I believe it's Dawn Staley is her name. I think it's her third championship. She has done a phenomenal job coaching South Carolina. I don't know the exact number, but in the last 3 seasons, her record is unbelievable. And yeah, she was able to do this without a single starter from the team last year. So great job to all those players, great job to the coach, and fantastic job to South Carolina as a whole, getting a undefeated season. That is, it doesn't matter what sport, one hell of an accomplishment. So congrats to them. And then you got the Iowa Hawkeyes coming so close yet so far, 2 years in a row. Caitlin Clark walks away with lots of records, but no championship, unfortunately. And yeah, then after that, we will move into the 2024 NCAA men's tournament bracket. And let's get right into it. So, it's a little bit different in men's basketball. You have East, West, South, and Midwest. So we're going to start with the Eastern Conference. This is round 1. This took place on March 21st and March 22nd. You've got the 1-seeded UConn Huskies taking on number 16 seed Stetson. UConn won by 39 points, winning 91-52. Then you have your first upset in overtime thriller between Florida Atlantic University and Northwestern. Northwestern would win that game 77-65. Then you have the runner-up from last year's tournament, 5th-seeded San Diego State taking on UAB. San Diego State would win that game 69-65. Then you have 4th-seeded Auburn facing off against 13th-seeded Yale. A lot of people had Auburn going to the Final Four. It was in the championship game. I remember seeing that they were heavily picked to win. But yet another big upset on this side of the bracket. You have Yale defeating them 78-76. Then you have 6th-seeded BYU facing off against 11th-seeded, I don't know how to say this, Duquesne University. And yeah, another upset with Duquesne taking down BYU 71-67. Then you have 3rd-seeded Illinois facing off against 14th-seeded Morehead State. Illinois would win that game healthily, 85-69. Then you have 7th-seeded Washington State facing off against 10th-seeded Drake. Washington State wins that game 66-61. And finally, you have Iowa State facing off against South Dakota State, with Iowa State getting the win with a final score of 82-65. So 46-46. Then you have another upset, ninth-seeded Texas A&M taking down the Nebraska Cornhuskers, who were the 8th seed, with a final score of 98-83. Then you have the 5th-seeded Wisconsin taking on the 12th-seeded James Madison, and JMU got the best of Wisconsin. So yeah, another upset. James Madison wins that game 72-61. Then you have 4th seed Duke taking on 13th seed Vermont. Duke wins that game 64-47. And then you have 6th seeded Texas Tech facing off against 11th seeded NC State. NC State led by DJ Burns. He's this, heavyset guy. He's been compared to Jokic, left-handed Jokic. Some people have said he's got a lot of human to him, if you know what I mean. He's a big dude. But yeah, very talented guy. He led NC State to a victory in round 1 over Texas Tech, getting the upset win, and they walked away with a final score of 80-67. Then you have, I would say, the biggest upset of round 1. Kentucky at number 3 goes down to 14th seed Oakland. Oakland winning 80-76. As I mentioned, Kentucky features one of the only men's basketball players that I know, Rob Dillingham. For that reason, when I made my bracket, I had Kentucky in the championship game, and so for them to go down in the first round was pretty funny on my end. Oakland, on the other hand, led by Jack Goelke. This guy is he's a shooter. He only shoots threes pretty much. He took a bunch of shots, like out of 300 shots that he took in the last season, 8 of them were 2-pointers. And he was just shooting lights out. He could not miss in that game, and yeah, truly unfortunate. Kentucky was playing pretty good defense on him too, but the guy was just making everything. Then you have another upset with the 10th seed Colorado Buffaloes taking down 7th seeded Florida 102-100. And finally you have 2nd seed Marquette facing off against 15th seed Western Kentucky, with Marquette getting the win 87-69. Next, we will move into the West region, where you have UNC facing off against Wagner. This is a battle between the 1 seed and the 16th seed. UNC would win this game 90-62. Then you've got 8th seeded Mississippi State facing off against 9th seeded Michigan State, with another upset, Michigan State winning 69-51. After that, you have the 5th seeded St. Mary's facing off against the 12th seeded Grand Canyon University. Grand Canyon also pulled off an upset, winning 75-66. It's crazy how many upsets there were in the men's bracket and how many lack of upsets there were in the women's bracket. I can't tell if it's just like these smaller schools just popped off, or if the seeding is better in the women's bracket. I don't know at all. Then you've got 4th seed Alabama facing off against 13th seed Charleston. Alabama would win that game 109-96. You have 6th seeded Clemson facing off against 6th-seeded South Carolina facing off against 11th-seed Oregon. Yet another upset in this bracket. Oregon getting the victory 87-73. Then you have 3rd-seeded Creighton facing off against 14th-seed Akron. Creighton gets the win with a final score of 77-60. After that, you have 7th-seeded Texas facing off against 10th-seed Colorado State. Texas wins that game 56-44. And finally, you have 10th-seeded Tennessee facing off against 16th-seeded, 15th-seeded St. Peter's, winning 83-49. Tennessee did. And so, yeah, that is that. Now we move into the second round, which took place from March 23rd to March 24th. So first up in the East, you've got, I don't know what noise that was. You have UConn Huskies taking on Northwestern, and UConn won that game 75-58. Then you've got San Diego State challenging Yale 85-57. San Diego won that game. Then you have Illinois taking on Duquesne, and Illinois won that game 89-63. And then you have Iowa State facing off against Washington State, with Iowa State winning 67-56. So no upsets in that part of the bracket in this round. Then you have 1st-seeded Houston facing off against 9th-seeded Texas A&M. Houston getting the win in overtime, 100-95. Then Duke taking down James Madison, 4th seed. The 4 seed taking over the 12 in a huge victory, 93-55. Then you have an overtime game between Oakland and NC State. Jack Kowalski versus DJ Burns, and NC State walked away with the victory in overtime, winning 79-73. And finally, you have Marquette facing off against Colorado, with Marquette getting the victory 81-77. So no upsets in that part of the bracket either. Moving into the West, you've got North Carolina against Michigan State. North Carolina winning that game 85-69. Then Alabama against Grand Canyon. You have Alabama winning that game 72-61. Then you have the first upset in this round. It is 6th-seeded Clemson taking down 3rd-seeded Baylor in a game that finished with 72-64 in favor of Clemson. Then you have 2nd-seeded Arizona taking down 7th-seeded Dayton with a final score of 78-68. And then we will move into our 4th and final part of the bracket, the Midwest. You've got number 1 seed Purdue beating number 8 seed Utah State 106-67, almost 40 points. Then you have 5th-seeded Gonzaga taking down 4th-seeded Kansas, upset alert, with a final score of 89-68. Then you have a double overtime game, the first double overtime game of the tournament. And this was between Oregon and Creighton. Eventually, Creighton would get the victory, winning 86-73, but Oregon would not go down without a fight. And then finally, you have number 2 seeded Tennessee over finish with yet another upset. Duke was able to take down Houston with a final score of 54-51. After that, we have NC State against Marquette. Marquette is the 2 seed, NC State is the 11 seed, but it does not matter. We have yet another upset on this side of the bracket, with NC State toppling Marquette with a final score of 67-58. Then, moving into the West, we've got North Carolina versus Alabama. You know, I feel like this game, I don't know, very familiar. North Carolina and Alabama faced off. UNC obviously had the 1, and Alabama was the 4. And Alabama was able to steal it at the last second, winning 89-87. Then you've got a battle between the 2nd-seeded Arizona and 6th-seeded Clemson. Yet another upset. So 2 upsets on this side of the bracket, with Clemson beating Arizona 77-72. And then you have the Midwest, where Purdue faced off against Gonzaga. Purdue won that game 80-68. And then you have number 2 Tennessee versus number 3 Creighton, with Tennessee winning 82-75. So after that, we move into our Elite 8. So in the battle of the Eastern region, you have UConn and Illinois facing off. UConn would get the best of Illinois, the 1 over the 3 seed, winning 77-52. Then, for the first time ever in March Madness history, we have a 4 seed versus an 11 seed, and this was in the Southern region. So you've got Duke versus NC State to finish as representative of the South. NC State would actually win this game over Duke, so we have an 11 seed in the Final Four. Absolutely remarkable season by DJ Burns and NC State this year. They faced, I think they had like 8 or 9 straight elimination games because they were so close to not making the tournament. They like barely hit this one shot, and then they won a few games in a row, and then they just kept going. So it looked like they wouldn't even make the tournament, and then they really made some waves. So fantastic push by NC State. After that, you have Clemson and Alabama, a college football usual, but this time we got to see it in men's basketball. Alabama being the 4 seed and Clemson being the 6 seed, Alabama was able to get the best of the Clemson Tigers with a victory, final score being 89-82. And finally, in the Midwest, you have technically the most boring bracket, you could say, in terms of the final game being the 1 seed versus the 2 seed, Purdue versus Tennessee, with Purdue winning. So, based on all of that, you have your Final Four, which took place on April 6th. This was 2 games, one between the East and the West, and then one between the South and the Midwest. So, UConn representing the East and Alabama representing the West, they faced off, and this was, I believe, the most challenging game for Utah thus far. Sorry, what am I saying? UConn. The Huskies, they won last year, and they really did not face any difficulty in their first couple games, because Stetson, they beat them by 29 points, then Northwestern, they beat them by 17 points, then San Diego State, they beat them by 30 points, then Illinois, they beat them by 25 points, and this game they only won by 14 points. So, you know, a bit more challenging, but not really. It's still a huge victory. And then you have NC State versus Purdue, which was a battle of the great bigs, Zach Edey versus DJ Burns. A lot of anticipation for that matchup. You know, Zach Edey absolutely dominated in this tournament, putting up 20 and 10 performances in every single game that he played, and Purdue walked away with victory in this game as well, toppling NC State 63-50. So that sets us up for our championship game, a battle between 2 1 seeds Badgers just could not take down the Huskies. The Huskies would win this game 75-60, with Zach Day scoring over 60% of his team's total points. The Huskies were just too good, so they win back-to-back. They join a very small list of teams that has been able to win back-to-back championships. And yeah, congratulations to the UConn Huskies. Not a small feat at all. There's this clip that's going around of the Huskies coach talking, I think in 2020, saying like, you guys get the best of us right now while you still can, because we're coming. And very menacing statement, very awesome statement to look back on when you come a few years later and just absolutely destroy all these teams. Like, the closest game that UConn had was their game against Alabama, and they still won that by 14. So I think the Huskies have set a record for the most number of double-digit wins in tournament, like consecutive double-digit wins. They're going back into last year easily. I want to say it's like almost 10 at this point. So yeah, until the Huskies face a real challenge, it's really theirs. They have dominated this tournament 2 years in a row. So congrats to them. And that wraps up both our men and women's NCAA March Madness tournaments from this year, 2024. So if you didn't watch any of the games, you didn't really get any information from this, but you got to see how the brackets played out. A bunch of people had their brackets broken in the first week, just because the men's tournament had like a historic number of upsets in the first round. So, I made one bracket just for fun, but in my bracket, I think I had North Carolina beating Kentucky to win it all. North Carolina did not make the Final Four. They were not that close either, unfortunately. They made the Elite 8, right? No, they made the Sweet 16. So, they petered out at Sweet 16, though they were close. And, yeah, Kentucky lost in the first round, so my bracket busted immediately. But, it's fun. I always make one just for fun, even though I don't watch college basketball at all or keep up with it or know anything about it, to be honest. But I definitely paid attention a little more this year than years prior, so I think if I were a betting man, which I am, I would probably put my money on UConn again just because. So, yeah, that's that. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy content like this, feel free to like, comment, or subscribe for more. I'll be putting out more videos as the week goes on. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.